Leichhardt was fired with a grand plan. Let me explain this. Like many young scientists of his time, Leichhardt was greatly influenced by the work of the German scientist Alexander von Humboldt. We know this from one of Leichhardt's letters where he said, "As for Humboldt, he set the example that I've never forgotten. My admiration for him is boundless." So what was Humboldt's example? It was his recognition that the Earth and its oceans and atmosphere was an integrated physical system, and that flora, fauna and climate are influenced by the interaction of major geographical features, oceans, deserts, mountain ranges and so on. And because of Humboldt's work, Leichhardt was keenly aware of the need to look at the big picture. In various letters he wrote, he said he wanted to discover the northern extent of Sturt's Desert, the gradual change in plant and animal life from one coast to the other, and to map the northern, northwestern and western watersheds. From these statements, we can see that Leichhardt's grand plan was to follow Humboldt's teachings by determining the major geographical and biological features of the northern half of the continent.
He has a wry comment in a letter to his brother-in-law, and as for Humboldt, he set the example that I have never forgotten. My admiration for him is boundless, but I feel that my slender means will always hold me far short of his performance. So he was very well aware of his limited means, and this was a problem for him. Now, I have a great many examples of Leichhardt's prescience, his ability to make very accurate and detailed observations across a range of disciplines, but you've already heard his comment about, or suggestion that he arrived in Australia immediately, very shortly anyway, dismissed the notion of an inland sea. And he states this in a letter to one of his professors in Berlin, Heinrich William Dove. If it be true that the remarkable hot northwesterly winds are masses of air which have been heated and have risen over the tropical part of New Holland, their astonishing dryness would be decisive indication of a desert in the interior of the country. So right then, he knew it was arid out there, before Sturt or before anybody went out there. He wrote, both in the journal and in his letters, wonderful comments. Here's an example. He studied in Paris with Dumeril. He had quite an interest in fish. On the Port Essington expedition, one of his party shot a very large fish in the Mackenzie River. Brought it back to camp. Leichhardt was able to identify this fish, which he says Murphy shot an osteoglossum. Now these were known from fossils, Eocene fossils in Europe. And he recognised it. This is one of those, for God's sake. So he preserved it and carried it with him. And he afterwards found this fish in the waters flowing into the Gulf. And in fact, this is the northern, now known to be the northern species. And that's where they went from there. Because he had Gilbert was Gould's collector, a very experienced collector, bird stuffer. Leichhardt really took a bow to Gilbert. He didn't intrude on his field of expertise. And Chisholm wrote papers on the birds of Gilbert's diary and neglected to take into account that Leichhardt actually recorded birds all through his diary. And there's a difference. And that is that Leichhardt recorded nocturnal birds. Gilbert never did, unless he shot one. If he had a specimen, he would record it. But Leichhardt recorded barking owls, nightjars, bearbook owl, night birds. He knew them from his earlier experience in Australia, those first 2 years. He knew his birds very well, and it's quite obvious. he recorded black swans, which weren't in Gilbert's list. Now, it's true that they weren't always together. They were at the same camp, but they were scouting out. Following, you see a change in colour there. See that change? That's where Gilbert was speared and disappeared. He was no longer part of the expedition. This is the Leichhardt track. As soon as they hit sandstone country, Leichhardt recorded this bird, the sandstone shrike thrush, which has a wonderful song. This is from the Australian Bird Atlas, showing where it's been recorded. But of course, he didn't collect it, and in fact, it wasn't really named for another 30 or 40 years after this. Now we come to the meatier bit. What I've done is to compare and contrast Leichhardt with some of the greats of his contemporaries of the period. Humboldt, of course, who lived to a very old age, Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, and von Mueller. And there are some very interesting homologies involved with these people. In every case, they were expected to take a different track in their professional development, but all became enamoured of the natural world and went off in their separate ways. Probably the most conservative member from that respect is von Mueller, who actually completed a PhD in botany in Kiel University. And he was very much the botanist, but rather more than that. But these others had very broad interests, very different original beginnings, but all of them in their late 20s, mid to late 20s and early 30s had their Wanderjahr experience. Von Humboldt in Central and South America, but apart from that, a lot of travel in Europe. Darwin, of course, the voyage on the Beagle. Leichhardt with his 3 expeditions. Alfred Russel Wallace, his first expedition to the Amazon with Bates, which ended in disaster. His collections and most of his notes were lost at sea when their ship caught fire. They were lucky to survive. But he came back from that, and then he went to the Malay Archipelago. And it's just illustrating, in each case, Humboldt, Darwin, and Leichhardt, and Wallace, but not so much Mueller, all established reputations on the basis of the expedition reports. Voyage of the Beagle, Journal to Port Essington, and von Humboldt's marvellous account of his time in Central and South America. But their great works took many, many years to gestate. Many years. In the case of Humboldt, his grand epic piece, Cosmos, he didn't start till he was 79. And it's really trying to illustrate that the field experience and the collections and the notes and the observations are one thing, but synthesising those, producing the synthesis of all of this work takes time. And the problem for Ludwig Leichhardt was he didn't get time. He disappeared at age 35. So we'll never know, in some respects, what he would have produced. I can give you... Look, there's so many things. He met Humboldt. He was in correspondence with Humboldt. All four of the people below Humboldt were greatly influenced by Humboldt, corresponded with Humboldt, and revered him. And in fact, Darwin, I won't read it, it's too soppy. But I could find no evidence that Leichhardt was aware of Darwin's great work. Of course, his theory of evolution occurred much later, 1859. By that time, Leichhardt was long gone. But on the voyage back from their rescue from Port Essington, on the Heroine, just beyond Cape Melville, Leichhardt had a chance to examine a coral reef. And he says, the theory of Darwin becomes more and more improbable. There must be another, more satisfactory explanation, because he was referring to Darwin's concept of the subsiding volcanic mountain, subsiding below the sea, and the reefs progressively growing upward to compensate for that sinking. And his evidence was that, well, as far as he could see, the coastline there was rising, not sinking. And it took another 40 or 50 years to establish that corals actually can grow whether it's rising, subsiding, or even stable sea level. And that's the only evidence I could find that he had actually had contact or knowledge of Darwin. The botanical work has been referred to by Tom, and we have some excellent recent papers which evaluate that. What we haven't had any real discussions of are the ethnobotany component. Leichhardt was quite remarkable. He would taste or eat anything that he felt had some potential value. And through the journal, there are lots, almost daily, there are comments on, the little 7 tree had a yellow or red 3-capsular fruit with a thin, fleshy pericarp of an exceedingly bitter taste. And that was the quinine tree, Petalostigma pubescens. Then he has other comments like, the emu here feeds on the fruits of this little 7 tree, which is so excessively bitter as to impart its quality to the meat and even to the gizzard and the very marrow. He was a great feeder on emus. But he checked and tested and ate, certainly to the disadvantage of his mouth and his gizzard, quite often. But they ate the native portulaca, the pigweed, and it's quite true that none of his men suffered from scurvy, as did a number of other explorers. Another really interesting point to me is his medical background, which he did make use of on a number of occasions, both on the voyage out and at settlements that he visited where people had eye problems and other difficulties. He even performed an operation on a young lad, which I won't go into. But at the attack up in the Gulf, where Gilbert was speared to death, 2 other members of the party were very savagely speared and bashed. They had multiple wounds, barbed spears. The barbed spears had to be pushed through or cut out. Now, when you think about that, here they are in the middle of nowhere with all of these terrible wounds, no antibiotics. Those guys lived to be old men. And he actually treated them, doctored them that night and the following morning. And later on in the journal, he describes a tree, and just in passing, he says, a small green-looking tree had wood of a brown colour which smelt like raspberry jam, and upon burning it, the ashes produced a very strong lye, an alkaline solution, which I used in dressing the wounds of my companions. And this is the gutta percha tree, which has a rubbery exudate. He burnt that tree and he used that in dressing the wounds of his companions. They survived.
It's time.
Yep.
Please.
Can I have just one final?
Sure. Okay.
I really wanted to... we've still got that up there. all of these people contributed to the development of the growing science of both ecology and landscape ecology. But ecology was first named by Ernst Haeckel, another German, 1866, so long after Leichhardt disappeared. Landscape ecology, not until 1939 by Karl Troll, an Austrian but another German speaker. And journals for landscape ecology were not published until 1987. But these people contributed to the development of those disciplines, and Leichhardt particularly so. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Henry. And yet again, we see the breadth of this man, and indeed what a loss to science, and a tragic loss. And as you say, everyone else got their opportunity to write their great work, and Leichhardt never got there because his remains are out there, most likely in the desert somewhere. So, one or two questions before lunch. Jeremy?
Jeremy.
Professor Nix and the two previous speakers, Jeremy Spencer, National Museum of Australia. 11 years ago I had occasion to go to Vienna and work in the Natural Historisch Museum on Baron Karl Freiherr von Hugel and searched thousands and thousands of herbarium specimens in the museum, in the Natural History Museum. What I found there was that there was the whole history of Australian botanical science that had never been touched by people like Hooker and Kew and in Paris, but was still in pristine condition. And I'm almost 100% certain I saw original Leichhardt specimens with little annotated labels there. I just bring it to your attention because
fantastic.
As far as the Austrians are concerned, everything was survived the war because it was kept in the salt mines at Salzburg, and the only stuff that was lost was some of the conifers, which are duplicate specimens in Belgium.
Right.
Just brought to your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Many Leichhardt collected for many people, and I think this was partly commercial. I mean, he would have received some payment, and some of those specimens were probably traded. So, and certainly they do with zoological specimens. So they can be, like, for instance, Gilbert's specimens of the birds that he collected are found in museums both sides of the Atlantic, about 4 or 5 different museums in Europe, a few in England, places you'd least expect them. And they've finally been tracked down, almost to the last specimen. But as I said, unfortunately, only a few new species were added up to the point where Gilbert was killed.
I found it very interesting that I think he was looking for diprotodons when he did his first trip. He's clearly very interested in them and found some recent bones.